She was a young black woman, 22 years old, taking the bus to work every single morning before the sun came up, sending half her paycheck home to keep her sick mother alive. She asked for nothing. She complained to no one. She simply showed up, did her work, and disappeared into the background of a mansion so large it had rooms that no one ever entered. And on the day the most powerful Korean mafia boss in Los Angeles was declared dead, she was the only one in that entire house who genuinely grieved him. Not his wife, not his children, not the men who had sworn loyalty to his name for decades. Her, the maid, the one nobody saw. But his wife saw her. Oh, she saw her. And before the body was even cold, before a single tear had dried on anyone's face, Soo-yeon picked up a pen and wrote a dismissal list. 14 employees. And the name she placed first was Cassidy's. No warning, no reason given, no severance. Just a folded paper delivered in a corridor by a manager who couldn't look her in the eyes. Cassidy walked out of that mansion with everything she owned inside a plastic bag. The same plastic bag she had carried her resume in the day she arrived. What no one in that house knew, what his wife never imagined, was that Kwon Jae-Ho was not dead. He had been watching everything from the very beginning. Every phone call, every closed-door meeting, every decision his family made the moment they believed the lights were off. And he saw exactly who put Cassidy's name first on that list. What happened next changed everything. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a member and help our channel. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists inside a house that is too large for the love it contains. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of performance. The silence of marble floors that have never heard bare feet running. The silence of dining tables set for 8 when only 3 people sit down and none of them speak about anything that matters. The silence of a house that was built to impress people who were never actually invited inside. The Kwon Mansion in Bel Air, Los Angeles, had 14 bedrooms, 3 swimming pools, a wine cellar that held bottles worth more than most people's annual salary, and a security system that could detect a footstep on the east lawn from a control room 3 floors underground. It had Venetian chandeliers that cast the entrance hall in the particular amber light that old money believes signals warmth. It had a library with first editions that no one read, and a garden pruned by a team of 6 men who arrived before dawn and left before the family woke. What it did not have, what it had never had in all the years of its existence, was a single room where a person could sit down and be completely, quietly, unreservedly themselves. Kwon Jae-Ho had built all of it with his own hands. Not literally. Men like Kwon Jae-Ho did not carry bricks. But every dollar that purchased every tile, every chandelier, every bottle of wine aging in the dark below ground had passed through decisions he made, territory he held, agreements he enforced, and enemies he buried. Sometimes also not literally, though more often than not, also literally. He had come from nothing. Not the romantic kind of nothing that memoirs dress up as noble poverty. The actual kind. The kind that leaves a permanent tension behind the eyes. A constant, low-frequency awareness that everything you have can be taken from you by someone willing to be crueler than you were on your worst day. He had learned to be that someone first. For 30 years, Kwon Jae-Ho had been the answer to every question about who controlled the movement of money, contraband, and silence across 3 continents. His name existed in the files of intelligence agencies in 4 countries, always accompanied by the same frustrating annotation: suspected, unconfirmed, no actionable evidence. His hotels were real. His logistics company was real. His charitable foundation, the one bearing his wife's name, which she ran with the focused energy of someone who understood that visibility was the best possible alibi, was real enough. Everything around him was real. Only the version of himself that the world was permitted to see was a carefully constructed fiction. And he was tired. Not in the way of a man who needed rest. In the way of a man who had looked at everything he built and realized, with the slow, devastating clarity that only comes at 3 a.m, that he had constructed an empire and forgotten to build a life inside it. His children had grown up watching him from a distance, learning to want what he had without understanding what it had cost. His wife had learned to perform beside him with the professional precision of a woman who had made her calculation early and never recalculated. His associates respected him absolutely and would put a bullet in his head the moment respect became less profitable than the alternative. He was surrounded by people at all times. He had never been more alone. It was in this particular condition, this specific variety of gilded isolation, that Cassidy Renee Monroe entered the house for the first time. On a rainy October morning, with wet shoes and a resume inside a plastic bag, because she had not owned an umbrella that year and could not afford to ruin the only printed copy she had. She was 20 years old then, 2 years younger than the age at which most people in her position would have already surrendered to a smaller version of their dreams. She had not surrendered. Not because she was unaware of the obstacles arranged against her. She was profoundly aware of them, had been aware of them since she was old enough to understand why her mother worked 2 jobs and still watched the bank account with the anxious attention of someone monitoring a patient in critical condition. She had not surrendered, because surrender required a moment of decision, and Cassidy had never allowed herself to arrive at that moment. She simply kept moving. She kept her head up on the bus at 5 a.m. She kept her uniform clean with an iron she had bought secondhand. She kept the small gold star at her throat, the one her mother had pressed into her palm on the night of her 18th birthday, saying, "You were born to be brighter than all of this, baby." And she kept walking forward into whatever room the day required of her. The room that October morning was the Kwon Mansion's formal reception area, where a household manager with the demeanor of a man who had seen everything and been impressed by none of it asked her 3 questions and began to explain that her experience level was perhaps not quite what the position. And then the door opened. He did not announce himself. Men like Kwon Jae-Ho did not announce themselves in their own houses. He walked through the door as he walked through every room, with the complete physical certainty of a person who has never had to wonder whether there was space for him. His presence was not aggressive. It was simply total. The air in a room where he stood was different from the air in a room where he was absent, and everyone within that air felt the difference immediately, though few could have explained why. He looked at her. Not the way powerful men usually looked at young women in positions of vulnerability. She had been looked at that way before and knew how to build a wall behind her eyes in under a second. This was different. He looked at her the way a person looks at something that surprises them in a moment when they had stopped expecting to be surprised. She did not look away. That was the thing. Every other person in that room, the household manager, the 2 other staff members present, the security guard by the inner door, all of them shifted their gaze the moment Kwon Jae-Ho entered. the way people instinctively look at the floor near a source of too much heat. Cassidy Monroe met his eyes and held them. Not with defiance, with dignity. The particular dignity of someone who has nothing to prove and no performance to maintain. He said 2 words to the household manager. He walked out. She was hired that afternoon. She would spend months afterward trying to understand that morning. She never came to a single, clean conclusion. What she eventually accepted, not as explanation but as simple fact, was that something had been recognized by something, across a room where recognition was not supposed to happen. She did not assign it a name. She was too practical for the names available. The first 6 months were exactly what they appeared to be. She arrived before 6, she cleaned, she organized, she served. She learned the patterns of the house the way a person learns the particular rhythms of a piece of music. Where the pauses were, where the sudden crescendos came, which silences meant danger, and which meant simply that no one was paying attention. She learned that the household manager reported daily to the mistress of the house. She learned that the mistress of the house cataloged every detail of the staff's behavior with the precise attention of a woman who understood that information was the only currency that retained its value, regardless of market conditions. She learned to be invisible in the specific way that houses like this required. Present enough to be useful, absent enough to be forgotten. She was very good at it, but she made one mistake in the 6th month. She was honest. Not in a dramatic way, not with any intention of consequence. It was a cold December night, and she was in the library, the only room in the house that felt, to her, like it had been built for a human being rather than for the impression of one. Reorganizing the shelves after the patriarch's eldest son had spent an afternoon pulling volumes out and replacing them incorrectly while searching for something he clearly had not found. She was alone. She thought she was entirely alone. She was not. Kwon Jae-Ho was in the hallway just outside the open door, speaking to himself in Korean, in the low, fractured tone of a man who had exhausted every other audience. She heard enough, without understanding the language, to recognize the particular sound of loneliness that needs no translation. And before she could stop herself, before the carefully constructed instinct of invisibility could intervene, she said something small and true into the quiet room. Solidarity in a big house is the heaviest, she said softly. A phrase her mother said in moments of impossible weight. She had not even been sure she was saying it aloud. He stopped. He turned. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. And for the first time in longer than either of them could have measured, someone in this house had said something real. Neither of them had been prepared for what that would cost. What followed that December night was not a romance in the way that word is usually understood. It was not candlelit dinners or stolen glances across crowded rooms. It was quieter than that, and therefore more dangerous. It was 2 people discovering, in the margins of a life that had no legitimate space for them, that the other person made the world slightly more bearable than it had been the day before. And in a house built entirely on performance, that discovery was the most subversive thing that could have possibly occurred. It began with books. He had noticed, in the weeks following that December night, that she reorganized the library not randomly, not alphabetically, not by the conventional systems that the household manager had imposed, but by something else entirely, something intuitive and personal that he could not immediately decode. He stood in the doorway one morning watching her work and realized, with a start, that he disguised immediately behind his habitual stillness, that she was organizing them by emotional weight. The books that demanded the most from their reader on the left, the ones that gave something back on the right, the ones that did both together in the middle. He asked her about it that evening, when the house had settled into its nighttime rhythms and she was finishing the last of her duties in the corridor outside the library. He did not soften the question or approach it indirectly. Men like Kwon Jae-Ho did not know how to be indirect about things they were genuinely curious about. Indirection was a tool he reserved for business, where curiosity was a weapon to be concealed. Here, in this corridor, with this woman, he simply asked. She told him. She told him that her mother had taught her that books were like people, that you had to be careful about which ones you let sit next to each other, because the energy of one bleeds into the other whether you intend it or not. She said it matter-of-factly, with the ease of someone sharing a practical household tip rather than a philosophy. And then she looked at him with those dark, steady eyes and said that she figured the same was probably true of the people you kept close to yourself, not just the books. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, in a voice slightly lower than his usual register, that he thought she might be the most quietly dangerous person he had encountered in 30 years of a profession that required him to evaluate danger as a primary skill. She said, without missing a beat, that she was a maid who took the bus to work, and he was a billionaire in a 14-bedroom house, and perhaps he needed to recalibrate his instruments. He laughed. A real laugh. Not the controlled, socially functional sound he produced at business dinners and family occasions, but an actual, unguarded laugh, the kind that arrives before the defenses can stop it. It surprised him so completely that he stopped it almost immediately and looked away, as if embarrassed by his own involuntary humanity. She pretended not to notice. She was already understanding, without having been told, that this man's most vulnerable moments required the courtesy of not being witnessed too directly. That was the beginning. Over the months that followed, the late evenings in and around the library became a quiet ritual that neither of them named or formally acknowledged. He would finish whatever the day had demanded of him, the calls, the meetings, the careful management of men who were loyal only as long as they were afraid. And he would find himself, without quite deciding to, in the corridor outside the library at the hour when he knew she was finishing. She would be there. They would talk. Not about anything that could be used against either of them, about her mother's illness and the particular helplessness of watching someone you love suffer in increments too slow to feel like crisis and too relentless to ignore. About his early years in Seoul, the version of his biography that existed nowhere in any file or profile. The boy before the man. The hunger before the empire. About what she would do if she could do anything. About what he would have done differently if he had understood at 20 what he understood now at 54. He listened to her the way he had forgotten how to listen to anything, completely, without preparing his response while she was still speaking, without calculating the angle or the use of what she was saying. He simply listened. And she, in turn, told him things she had told no one else, because something in the quality of his attention made the telling feel safe in a way that was entirely irrational, given everything she knew about who and what he was. She knew exactly who and what he was. She was not naive. She had grown up in a world that did not permit the luxury of naivety, and she had never resented this. It had made her perceptive in ways that more sheltered people simply were not. She knew the cars that arrived at unusual hours. She knew the conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. She knew that the household manager's daily reports to the mistress of the house included observations about which staff members spent time near which parts of the property. She knew all of this, and she continued anyway, because the alternative was to walk away from the only place in her daily life where she was seen as something other than a function. What she did not know, what she could not have known, because he had told no one, was that Kwon Jae-Ho had received a medical diagnosis 4 months before that December night, delivered by a physician in a private clinic in Zurich with the gentle, practiced gravity of a man accustomed to delivering news that restructured the remaining time of a person's life. The diagnosis was not immediately fatal, but it was the kind of diagnosis that reorders a person's understanding of how many tomorrows they are working with, and what those tomorrows ought to contain. He had come home from Zurich and stood in the entrance hall of his 14-bedroom mansion and looked at everything he had built, and felt for the first time with absolute clarity that he had built it entirely in the wrong direction. The empire was real. The money was real. The power was real. But the relationships that were supposed to give all of it meaning, the wife, the children, the inner circle of men who called him their leader, every single one of those relationships was transactional at its core. And he had known this for years without allowing himself to know it in the way that required a response. The diagnosis made evasion impossible. He was going to die. Not today, not tomorrow, but within a horizon he could now see. And he was going to die without having been genuinely known by a single person who shared his daily life. And then a young woman in a rainy October morning had sat in his reception room and met his eyes without flinching, and said something honest in December that he had not heard in longer than he could measure. And without any plan or intention, he had begun to understand that the most dangerous thing she carried was not anything she did or said, but simply the fact of her presence. The way her existence in the house made the house feel, for the first time, like somewhere a real person lived. He did not tell her about the diagnosis. He did not tell anyone. But it shaped everything that followed. It was the invisible architecture behind every decision he made in the months that came after, including the one that would shake the entire structure of his world to its foundation. The plan to fake his death had not arrived all at once. It assembled itself gradually, the way large decisions often do. First as an abstract thought, then as a persistent consideration, then as a fully formed strategy that he recognized one morning in his study had already been made without him quite noticing the moment of commitment. He needed to know. He needed to see, with the absolute clarity that only the removal of himself from the equation could provide, who his children were when they believed the inheritance was suddenly available. Who his wife was when she believed the performance was no longer required. Who his associates were when the name Kwon Jae-Ho became past tense rather than present. He needed to know what he was leaving behind. And he needed to know what, or who, deserved to be left something. He made 3 phone calls to men he trusted with his life. Literally, empirically trusted, in the way that only decades of shared danger can produce. He contacted Gerald Park, who had been his attorney for 22 years and who received the outline of the plan with the measured expression of a man who had long ago accepted that his most important client operated outside the boundaries of conventional expectation. He arranged the medical documentation. He arranged the apartment in Santa Monica. He arranged the cameras, not just the existing security system, but additional feeds precisely placed in every room where he expected the most revealing moments to occur. And on a Tuesday morning in March, Kwon Jae-Ho ceased to exist, at least officially. He was in Santa Monica by 9 that morning, sitting in a plain chair with a cup of coffee, watching the feeds from 12 cameras simultaneously on a laptop screen, wearing the same black suit he always wore, but without the watch, without the shoes, without any of the external signals of the man the world had known. He looked, in that moment, less like a crime lord and more like what he actually was. A man in his mid-50s, alone in a room, waiting to find out whether the life he had lived had produced anything worth the cost of it. The feeds came in live. And in the library camera, the one he had added specifically, the one he told himself was for general security purposes and not for any particular reason, he watched a 22-year-old woman in a black dress and white apron receive the news of his death. He watched her hand rise slowly to the small gold star at her throat. He watched her stand completely still for exactly 3 seconds. He watched her walk away to do her work, as if the ground beneath her had not just shifted irreversibly, as if she were holding the weight of it entirely inside herself, because there was nowhere in that house, and no one in that house, to whom she could offer it. And Kwon Jae-Ho, who had not cried since A Night in Seoul in 1994, that he had spent 30 years refusing to revisit, felt something move behind his eyes that he did not immediately allow to arrive. He set down his coffee. He looked at the empty chair across from him. And he thought, with the devastating simplicity of a truth that has waited too long to be acknowledged, she is the only one in that house who is grieving me. And she is the one I gave nothing to. Not yet. The mansion had never been louder than in the days following Kwon Jae-Ho's supposed death. Not loud in the way of grief, loud in the way of machinery. The sound of people moving quickly through corridors with purpose that had nothing to do with mourning and everything to do with positioning. Phones ringing in rooms with closed doors. Voices dropping to urgent whispers that stopped the moment a servant passed. The particular acoustic signature of a power vacuum being rushed by people who had been waiting with varying degrees of patience for exactly this moment. Kwon Jae-Ho watched all of it from Santa Monica. He had set up the laptop on a plain wooden table beside the window that faced the ocean, and he watched the 12 feeds with the focused, dispassionate attention of a man reviewing surveillance footage of strangers, which, in the most honest interpretation of what he was witnessing, was precisely what he was doing. The people moving through the rooms of his house with such urgent purpose were strangers wearing the faces of his family. He had always suspected this. He had needed to see it confirmed before he could act on the knowledge without the interference of hope. Hope, he had learned over 54 years, was the most expensive luxury a man in his position could afford. It cost more than any other indulgence because it distorted the intelligence. It made a man see what he wanted rather than what was there. He had excised hope from his professional life decades ago and replaced it with accurate assessment. He was applying that same discipline now, watching his son, his daughters, his wife, and understanding with clinical clarity that he had been, in the most intimate theater of his existence, catastrophically imprecise. Min-jun moved first, as expected. The eldest son had always operated on the assumption that speed was the same thing as strength, that the person who acted first controlled the outcome. It was a philosophy that had served him adequately in the lower-stakes negotiations his father had permitted him to manage over the years, and it had produced in him an unexamined confidence that he was, beneath the surface of his father's dominance, the natural heir to everything. He was wrong about this in ways he had never been required to discover, because his father had always been present to absorb the consequences of his son's miscalculations before they became visible. He was not present now. Min-jun sat in the private study on the second floor, his father's study, which he had entered without hesitation on the morning of the second day, sitting in the chair behind the desk with the ease of a man taking possession of something he believed he had always been owed. and made a series of calls to a financial consultant in Geneva. The calls were not encrypted. Min-jun had always operated on the assumption that his father's security infrastructure existed to protect the family, not to monitor it. This assumption was, in retrospect, the most expensive mistake of his life. Kwon Jae-Ho listened to every word. He did not react. He simply noted, with the precision of a man compiling evidence for a verdict he had already reached, that his eldest son's first response to his father's death was to secure personal access to assets that did not yet legally belong to him, using the authority of a name he had not yet been granted the right to carry. He noted it. He moved on to the next feed. Daeun was more sophisticated, and therefore, in a way, more disappointing. Sophistication implied awareness. It implied that she knew exactly what she was doing, had calculated the ethics of it, and had decided that the calculation came out in favor of action. She had always been the sharpest of the three children, the one who read rooms most accurately, who understood that power was less about what you held and more about what other people believed you held. She had learned this from her father, sitting across from him at dinners where he would occasionally, in rare expansive moods, speak obliquely about the principles that had built the empire. She had listened carefully. She had learned the lesson with genuine intelligence. She had simply learned it without the accompanying moral architecture that her father had always privately believed, despite considerable evidence to the contrary, that he had somehow transmitted to his children by proximity. He watched her work the phones for 4 days with the controlled precision of a general realigning forces after a sudden change in command. She was good at it. He acknowledged this without pleasure. She called 12 of his most senior associates in the correct order, not alphabetically, not by seniority, but by influence network, which meant she had been studying the structure of the organization for longer than she had ever indicated. She offered each of them continuity, stability, the assurance that the transition would be seamless and that their arrangements would be honored. What she did not tell any of them was that she was making these calls unilaterally, without the knowledge of her mother or her brothers, and that the continuity she was promising was continuity under her sole authority. She was building a coup inside a mourning period. Kwon Jae-Ho sat back in his chair and looked at the ocean for a long moment. Then he looked back at the screen. His daughter's face was composed, focused, efficient. She looked, he realized, exactly like him. The observation did not comfort him. Taeyang did what Taeyang always did, which was to confound everyone's expectations by doing nothing that made strategic sense and everything that made human sense. He sat in the garden on the first day and did not move for most of it. On the second day, he walked to the kitchen, made himself coffee using the household staff's machine rather than the espresso system in the family dining room, and sat at the counter talking to one of the older housekeepers, a woman who had worked in the mansion for 11 years, about nothing in particular. About whether the lemon tree in the east garden was getting enough water, about a television program she had been watching. He sat there for 40 minutes and then went back to the garden. When Daeun found him on the afternoon of the second day and attempted to brief him on her strategic communications with the associates, he listened to her for approximately 90 seconds and then said, quietly and without hostility, that their father had been dead for 2 days, and perhaps they could wait at least a week before deciding who was going to run the organization that had killed every real relationship the man ever had. Daeun stared at him. Then she left without responding, because there was no strategically useful response to someone who insisted on speaking in terms that the strategy could not accommodate. Kwon Jae-Ho watched this exchange on the feed from the garden camera and felt something that he identified, after a moment's consideration, as the closest thing to pride he had experienced in years. Then he felt something adjacent to grief, because the pride arrived 20 years too late, in a format he had never known how to express, directed at a son he had consistently underestimated because the boy's refusal to perform strength had always read, to his father's calibrated eye, as weakness. It had never been weakness. It had always been the only authentic thing in the house. And then there was Soo-yeon. He had saved her feed for last each day, the way a person delays the thing they are most apprehensive about confronting. Not because he expected to be surprised by what he saw. He did not expect surprise, had not expected it for many years. But because watching his wife move through the days after his supposed death required him to sit with a particular variety of failure that was entirely his own. He had chosen her. He had maintained the arrangement for 27 years. Whatever she revealed in his absence was, in a direct and uncomfortable line of causality, the product of choices he had made. She moved through the house in the days following his death with the focused efficiency of a woman executing a plan that had been mentally rehearsed many times. She met with the family's lawyers on the morning of the first day, before the children, before anyone else, and secured her position relative to the estate with the practiced speed of someone who had long ago identified exactly which documents required her signature and in what order. She managed the public communications with impeccable grace, issuing a statement to the press that was sorrowful without being vulnerable, dignified without being cold, precisely calibrated to produce maximum sympathy while revealing nothing that could be used against her. She received condolence calls from the wives of powerful men with the warm composure of a woman holding herself together through sheer strength of character. She was performing grief with the technical precision of a professional. And on the fourth day, she called the household manager into her private sitting room and handed him a list. Kwon Jae-Ho was watching the feed from the sitting room camera when this happened. He saw the list change hands. He could not read it from the angle of the camera. He watched the household manager's expression as he looked at it. The slight tightening around the eyes, the barely perceptible hesitation before he nodded. And he understood, before any confirmation, that the list contained something he was not going to receive well. He found out what was on it within the hour, when the household manager delivered the termination notice to Cassidy Renee Monroe in the corridor outside the laundry room. The notice was on formal house stationery, which meant Soo-yeon had prepared it in advance, had typed it, printed it, folded it, at some point before handing it to the manager, which meant the decision had not been impulsive. It had been waiting. Kwon Jae-Ho watched Cassidy receive the paper. He watched her read it. He watched her face do something extraordinarily controlled. The kind of control that costs a great deal, that is purchased at the expense of something internal that the camera could not see, but that he understood completely, because he had spent 30 years paying the same price. She folded the paper once, placed it in the pocket of her apron, thanked the household manager, who looked at the floor when she said it, and walked away down the corridor with her back straight and her steps even. He was on his feet before he was aware of having stood up. He stood in the middle of the Santa Monica apartment with the ocean light coming through the window behind him, and his hands very still at his sides, and something moving through his chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but contained elements of both, along with something older and more foundational. The recognition of an injustice committed in his name, using the infrastructure of his world against the one person in that world who had never asked him for a single thing. He sat back down. He watched the rest of it. He watched her gather her few belongings into a plastic bag, the same kind of bag, he noted, that she had carried her resume in on the morning she arrived, with the methodical calm of a person who has learned not to give an audience to their own devastation. He watched her stop outside the library door. He watched her stand there, not touching anything, just looking at the shelves she had organized with her particular system of emotional weight. He watched her reach up and unclasp the gold chain from her neck. Slowly, carefully, the way you handle something irreplaceable, and place it on the corner of the desk beside his cup, with the handle turned outward exactly as he always left it. It was a gesture of such precise, quiet intimacy that it was almost unbearable to witness. She knew about the cameras. She had always known. And the gesture was not for them. It was a goodbye to a room, to a version of her life that was ending, to something that had lived, briefly and improbably, in the margins of an impossible situation, and that she was now, with that small gold star placed on the corner of a desk, formally releasing. He picked up his phone. His hands, which had not trembled in 30 years of situations that would have unmade most men, were not entirely steady. He dialed. "She is at the bus stop," the voice on the other end told him, "with a plastic bag." He closed his eyes. The ocean outside the window made no sound that he could hear. "Send a car," he said. "Bring her here." And then, because the man on the other end had worked for him long enough to understand that the pause before the next instruction meant it was the one that actually mattered, he waited. "She was the only real thing," Kwon Jae-Ho said finally, to himself as much as to anyone. "And I almost let her walk away to a bus stop with a plastic bag." He set the phone down. He looked at the empty chair across the table. And he began, for the first time in 30 years, to figure out how to make something right before it was too late to matter. The car that arrived at the bus stop on Sunset Boulevard was not one of the mansion's fleet vehicles. It was a plain black sedan, unmarked, driven by a man Cassidy had never seen before. She was sitting on the bench with the plastic bag on her lap and her hands folded over it when it pulled to the curb. And when the window came down and the driver said her name, not miss, not ma'am, just her name, Cassidy, spoken with the quiet certainty of someone who had been told exactly who they were looking for, she felt something shift in the architecture of the moment that she could not immediately explain. She got in. She did not ask where they were going. She understood, in the wordless way that the past 2 years had trained her to understand certain things, that the answer was already known to her, even if she had not yet assembled it into conscious thought. She watched Los Angeles move past the window, the particular late afternoon light that turned everything amber and temporary, the kind of light that makes even the ordinary parts of the city look like they are in the process of becoming something else. And she held the plastic bag on her lap and kept her breathing even, and did not allow herself to think too far ahead of the present moment, because the present moment was already requiring everything she had. The car stopped in front of a building in Santa Monica that was neither grand nor conspicuous. A residential building of the kind that exists in every expensive coastal city, understated in a way that only money can purchase. The anonymity itself, a form of luxury. The driver opened her door. He did not follow her inside. A second man she did not recognize was waiting in the lobby and guided her to an elevator without speaking. And the elevator opened onto a corridor, and the corridor led to a door, and the door opened before she could knock. Kwon Jae-Ho was standing on the other side of it. He was wearing the black suit without the watch. The tatuajes on his neck were fully visible above the open collar of the white shirt. He looked, in the context of this plain apartment with its wooden table and its ocean-facing window and its complete absence of the imperial infrastructure that usually surrounded him. Less like the man she had worked for, and more like the man she had actually known. The one from the library corridor. The one who had laughed his real laugh and then looked away because he did not know what to do with his own authenticity. She stopped in the doorway. She looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she said, with a quietness that was more devastating than any volume could have been, "You are not dead." It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was simply an observation, stated with the direct, unadorned clarity that had been, from the very beginning, the thing about her that he had been unable to look away from. "No," he said. "I am not dead." She nodded once. She came inside. She sat down in the plain chair across from the wooden table and placed the plastic bag on the floor beside her feet and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with those dark, steady eyes that had never once in 2 years given him anything other than the truth of what was actually behind them. "How long?" she asked. 3 weeks, he said. "The reading of the will is in 4 days." She absorbed this. "And what did you see?" He sat down across from her. He told her. Not the summarized version, not the strategic assessment. The actual account, in the order it had happened, with the details that had mattered, and the ones that had surprised him, and the ones that had confirmed what he had already known. He told her about Min-jun and the offshore account. He told her about Daun and the phone calls. He told her about Tae-young in the garden, talking to the housekeeper about the lemon tree and the way that image had produced in him something he was still not entirely able to name. And then he told her about the list. She did not react visibly when he mentioned it. She already knew she was on it. She had held the paper in her own hands. But something in the quality of her stillness changed when he said that the list had been prepared in advance, that it had been waiting, that her name had been first. She knew, Cassidy said. It was not a question either. "She suspected," he said. "For a long time. She is not a woman who acts on incomplete information." "Neither am I," Cassidy said. And then, after a pause that contained a great deal, "What do you want from me? Being here, I mean. What is it that you want?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the ocean was doing what oceans do in the late afternoon, moving with that vast, indifferent continuity that makes human urgency feel both more and less significant than it usually seems. "I want to tell you something that I should have said a long time ago," he said. "And I want to say it while I still have time to say it correctly." She waited. "You are the only person in my daily life who has ever treated me as though I was a human being first, and everything else second. I did not know what to do with that when it began. I am not certain I know what to do with it now. But I know that when I watched you leave today, with that bag, the same bag you came with, and I knew it was because of a list with your name at the top of it, written by a woman who was trying to erase the one true thing in my life before the inventory was even opened. I understood that I had allowed something real to be treated as though it was disposable. And I will not allow that to stand." Cassidy looked at him for a long time. "That is a very large statement," she said finally, "from a man who just faked his own death." He almost smiled. "I am aware of the irony." "Are you aware?" she said. And now her voice carried something beneath the steadiness. Not anger, not quite, but the weight of 2 years of careful, necessary invisibility finally being allowed to surface. That I have spent the last 2 years being the thing that nobody was supposed to see. That I cleaned the rooms and made the coffee and organized the library and had conversations in corridors that I knew could cost me everything. And I did all of it without asking you for a single thing. Because asking felt like it would make it into something it wasn't. And now you're sitting across from me in an apartment in Santa Monica, telling me that I was the only real thing. And I am holding a plastic bag with my jacket and my phone charger in it. Because your wife put my name first on a list? The room was very quiet.
Yes, he said. That is exactly what I am aware of. That is precisely what I am trying to correct.
She looked at the ocean through the window for a moment. Then she looked back at him. Correcting it doesn't uncorrect it, she said.
No,
He agreed.
it doesn't.
The silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that functions as a full conversation, that contains everything that has already been said and everything that cannot quite be said yet, and the shared acknowledgement that both of those things are present simultaneously. She had always been better at sitting inside those silences than he was. She did not fill them unnecessarily. It was one of the things that had undone him from the beginning, that quality of hers. The willingness to let a moment be exactly what it was, without rushing it toward resolution. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a folded document on the table between them.
Gerald Park has the formal version, he said. This is a copy. I wanted you to see it before the reading.
I did not want you to hear it for the first time in a room full of people who will be hearing things they did not expect. She looked at the document on the table. She did not pick it up immediately. What is it? She asked, though something in her voice suggested she was asking less because she didn't know, and more because she needed to hear him say it. It is a fund, he said, irrevocable, for your mother's treatment. Complete, every appointment, every medication, every specialist, for as long as she needs it. For a commercial property in whatever neighborhood you choose, to build what you want to build. And a personal reserve that means you will never again need to carry your resume in a plastic bag because you couldn't afford to let the rain touch it. Cassidy Monroe sat very still. The gold star was gone from her throat. She had left it on his desk in the library, and she had not yet received the small wooden box that would arrive 3 days later, returned to her without explanation, with the note folded inside. She sat with the bare skin of her collarbone catching the late light from the ocean window, and she looked at the document on the table, and she did not speak for long enough that the silence itself became a kind of answer to something he hadn't asked aloud. Then she picked up the document. She read it carefully, the way she read everything. Not quickly, not performatively, but with the actual full attention of someone for whom words on paper have always meant exactly what they say, and sometimes more. He watched her read. He did not speak. He understood, from 2 years of corridor conversations, that this was a moment that required him to simply be present and still, and to resist the impulse to fill the space with further explanation. When she finished, she placed it back on the table. She looked at him. "The star," she said quietly. "You still have it?" "Yes. I left it because I thought no one would see it." "I know," he said. "That is why it mattered." Another silence. Then, with the particular directness that had defined her from the first morning in his reception room. "What happens now? To you, I mean. You are alive? You have a diagnosis that you still haven't told me about, but that I have understood for a long time was the real reason behind all of this. What happens to you now?" He looked at her steadily. "Now I stop performing," he said. "What happens after that, I am not certain. But I intend to find out." 4 days later, in the conference room of Gerald Park's law firm, Kwon Jae-Ho appeared on a screen that no one had been told to expect, in a chair in front of an ocean-facing window, alive and composed and carrying the particular stillness of a man who has made his decisions and is no longer interested in managing other people's reactions to them. He spoke for 11 minutes. He said what he had seen. He named what it meant. He assigned consequences with the calm precision of a man who had spent 30 years understanding that clarity, delivered without anger, is the most powerful form of authority that exists. Min-jun left the room before the video ended. His lawyers were already receiving documents before he reached the elevator. Da-eun sat through the entire thing without moving. When it finished, she stood, smoothed her jacket, picked up her bag, and walked out without speaking to anyone. Which was, in its own way, the most honest thing she had done in 4 days, because it dispensed with the performance entirely and acknowledged, in the only language she had left, that she understood exactly what had happened and had no argument to offer against it. Tae-young stayed in his chair long after the screen went dark. The tears on his face were not wiped away. He did not apologize for them. He sat with them, the way he sat with everything, completely, without performance, without agenda. Soo-yeon looked at the document detailing the fund for Cassidy Renee Monroe and understood, in a moment of absolute and merciless clarity, that the woman she had placed first on a dismissal list had been placed first on an entirely different list by the man whose name Soo-yeon had carried for 27 years. She understood that the most devastating part of this was not the money. It was the language. She was never an employee of anyone. Those words, read aloud by Gerald Park in his measured attorney's voice, landed with the weight of a verdict that encompassed far more than the document it appeared in. She sat with the Birkin on her lap and the red lipstick perfectly in place and said nothing at all, which was, perhaps, the first entirely honest thing she had done in a very long time. 3 weeks later, in Inglewood, a young woman with honey golden skin and black curly hair that caught the morning light stood in the doorway of an empty commercial space and looked at the bare walls and the bare floor and the particular quality of silence that belongs to a room that has not yet decided what it is going to become. She had a set of keys in her hand. Her mother was in treatment. The bus pass was in a drawer at home, still there because habits of survival do not dissolve overnight. And she had not yet fully accepted that the morning alarm was no longer required. At her throat, the gold star had returned to its place. She stood in the doorway for a long time, the way she had stood in the doorway of the library on the last day. But differently. Not releasing something, receiving something. Taking in the dimensions of a space that was entirely hers, that no list could remove her from, that existed because someone had finally seen clearly what had always been there, and had chosen, in the time remaining to him, to correct the record. She stepped inside. The door closed softly behind her, and in the particular silence of a room that is waiting to become something, Cassidy Renee Monroe began, at last, to build. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been the person in the room that everyone looked past? The one who gave the most, asked for the least, and was still the first one removed when power decided to clean house? Have you ever watched someone confuse loyalty with weakness and treat the most genuine person in their life as though they were the most disposable? And have you ever witnessed the moment when the truth finally caught up with the people who thought they were untouchable and felt that quiet, deep sense of justice that no words quite managed to hold? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, loyalty, and karma, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.